everyone. Welcome to another video, another presentation on Snappy Insights by Dr. Mike. Today, I want to discuss the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I've chosen this title, which it reflects my bias, about this about the conflict going on in the Congo, and so I just want to analyze this conflict, explore the role of foreign influence and interference in the conflict, and maybe a little bit of history, regarding this conflict as well. So let's dive right in. Now, as you may already know, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been in conflict for a very, very long time, and this dates back to, the very beginning of the entire country itself, of the nation, the 1960s from independence. There has always been one war or the other, one violent conflict or the other, and this has been persistent. So um this is not something that is new, even though it is unfortunate, but the DRC has always been plunged, you know into conflict, and has experienced so many episodes of this conflict, which have also, of course, resulted in, as it has deepened the instability in the region, both political and economic instability. It has led to human rights, humanitarian crisis of various proportions, and this continues to be the case. All right. Now, paradoxically, the DRC happens to be one of the very richest, countries in terms of natural resources in Africa. All right. There's so many mineral resources, there's zinc, there's tin, there's gold, there's copper, and what have you. So many mineral resources in the DRC, and perhaps, you know, that may explain one of the reasons for the continued, violence in this region, which of course we're going to explore, subsequently in the presentation. All right. Understanding the DRC's crisis is important for both resolving the conflict issues and, of course, for the peace of the entire continent as well, especially the regions directly neighboring the DRC itself. Um, so this is what this presentation is about. We're exploring the conflict with the DRC, and then trying to see, a historical understanding of this conflict and why this conflict continues to persist. What are the driving factors? What factors continue to motivate and complicate this crisis conflict in the DRC? All right. Now, a bit of historical background. So the DRC gained independence in 1960, but before then, it was a colony of Belgium. All right. It was a colony of Belgium. It became a colony in 1908, and of course, it was ruled by the Belgian. It was ruled by Belgium. From 1885, when it was eventually captured and colonized by Belgium. It was ruled up to 1960, when it became independent. All right, and as with many other colonies in Africa, one of the major motivations for colonizing the DRC was the the magnitude of mineral wealth, in that region. Right, I mentioned already that the region is rich in mineral resources, yes, rubber, natural resources as well, ivory, and several other things. And the Congolese were also subjected to brutal force, which helped the Belgians to exploit and, export many of these resources at very little labor costs to them. So these were the kinds of things that went on from the 1880s, up to 1960, when the DRC eventually became independent. All right. Now, after independence, as with other African countries too, the DRC, it was plunged into political instability, motivated also by the interference of Belgium. I mean, it is obvious that, when a formerly colonized territory gains independence, then the interests of the former colonial masters, um, becomes threatened, as it were. And so that was the case here. The Belgian interests, in the region, became threatened. And so in 1961, Patrice Lumumba was assassinated, all right, which plunged the country, which began, despite of violence in the DRC. Mobutu Sese Seko, who was a military general, took over leadership in 1965, and he was, a military ruler in the DRC for 32 years, up to 1997, when he was ousted, by a rebel movement. So from 1960 up to 1997, when the DRC gained freedom from Seseko, you can imagine the kinds of the political atmosphere, the security atmosphere, in terms of conflict and violence in the region for those 32 years. Seseko was a dictator. He ruled with iron fist. There were so many human rights violations in during those decades of his rule. And of course, he was also sympathetic to the Belgians. He was serving the interests of the Belgians, while also serving his own personal interests too. All of these, of course, are in the literature, and you can read up, the rule of Seseko, at your own spare time. But from independence, down to 1997, when Seseko was removed from power, rebel forces took over. All right. And of course, these rebel forces were sponsored by neighboring countries of Rwanda and Uganda, who also had interests, right, in the DRC, in the resources, the reserves, the natural mineral resources of the DRC. And they felt that Seseko continuously remaining in power, doesn't serve their interests. And so they sponsored rebel groups, rebel forces who oust, Mobutu Sese Seko in 1997. And of course, these rebel forces have continued to operate in the DRC since then. The literature says that there are more than 100 armed groups that are operating within the DRC at the moment. All right. And that has complicated the security situation in the DRC, made it more volatile, made it, highly tensed and easily prone to violence, which of course is what we see currently ongoing in the region. There's also been the role of the UN. The UN peacekeeping forces have been in the DRC from the 1990s, and it is argued that there has not been so much of a benefit, of the UN peacekeeping forces in that region all this while. And in fact, in some cases, there have been protests and calls for the UN to withdraw its troops, by the Congolese to withdraw its troops because they don't think that there has been any benefit of the troops remaining in the DRC for this long. So this is just a historical background to show you that the conflict in the DRC dates back to so many decades ago, right from the very beginning of the DRC as a nation itself. All right. There have been those spikes of conflict, there have been those factors, that have made it very easy for conflict to reoccur and to be more complicated as they continue to occur. All right. Now, what are the major factors that are driving the conflict in the DRC? I've mentioned competition for natural resources. That is one of the major factors. Right, the fact that the DRC is very rich in natural resources, mineral resources, which are used in making smartphones, are used in powering technologies in the world, the world over. And competition for these resources are one of the major factors that are fueling and continue to complicate the conflict in the DRC. There's also ethnic and regional tension. I mentioned the role of Rwanda and Uganda. All right, if you remember the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, most of the Hutus, the Hutu tribe or the Hutu nation, which were expelled from Rwanda, went or became refugees in the eastern part of the DRC. And so that tension, has always been there between Rwanda and the DRC. The tussle for land, for border territories, and of course, this tension between this age-long tension between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Of course, the Rwanda is mostly Tutsi led, and they continue to sponsor attacks, to sponsor violence, against the Hutus who are in the eastern part of Uganda. So that also has been a very, very a very, very significant factor driving, you know, the conflict in the DRC at the moment. Some of the rebel groups, like I mentioned, some of the rebel groups sponsored by Rwanda, which is also Tutsi led, continue also to, instigate violence and pursue Rwanda's agenda, as it were, in the DRC. There's the role of weak governance and weak political institutions. The DRC has not been allowed to consolidate on its political gains right from 1960 when it gained independence. There have been one violence or the other. Seseko has ruled for over 3 decades, you know, and I think the very first and perhaps one of the only, you know, seemingly peaceful elections that have taken place was in 2018, when there was a presidential election and transition of power. But even that has also been controversial because, there have been political tension and debates and controversy against or over that election in 2018. So the political atmosphere in the DRC has been very, very polarized, has been very, very unsettled, right from the very beginning. And that also is a factor that continues to motivate and fuel the violence in that region. There's the role of foreign interference, right? And regional rivalries, right? So foreign interference, the role of the UN, the role of the West and the allies, the Western allies, all right, which are also which is also motivated by the competition for natural resources. Okay, there's China and the role of China in that region as well, with all its development aid and what it wants to get in exchange for development aid as well. So that is also a factor driving conflict in that region. And we have issues of humanitarian crisis and displacements. Over 6 million Congolese have been displaced internally and even as refugees, over the period of this conflict. And the figure continues to expand, the figure continues to increase. So that is also a factor that drives the conflict in the DRC. So we have talked about, competition for natural resources. We've talked about the ethnic and regional tension, of the Tutsis and the Hutus, sponsored the Tutsi-led rebels and backed up by Rwanda, against the Hutu tribe or the Hutu nation in Eastern Congo. We've talked about weak governance and political institutions. We've talked about the foreign interference, and then, of course, humanitarian crisis. All right. Now, what is the role of Rwanda and other foreign influences in this crisis? Um, we mentioned a little bit about Rwanda in the previous slide, right? Rwanda in 1994 experienced a very, very horrible genocide, which was a battle for supremacy over two ethnic or between two ethnic groups in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Eventually, as literature has it, the Tutsis prevailed, and the Tutsis have remained in power in Rwanda till date. Um, Paul Kagame, is of the Tutsi nation, and they remain in power till date. Right from 1994 after the genocide. All right, and so most of the Hutus who were able to escape and flee the genocide made home in Eastern Congo, which is, of course, is a border state to Rwanda. All right, they made their home there, and that the presence of the Hutus, have continued to generate controversy, for the Tutsi-led Rwandans, and the leadership structure in Rwanda, and so they continue to sponsor violence, continue to sponsor rebels to unsettle the Hutus in Congo, and of course, coupled with other interests that Rwanda has also in the DRC. All right, so those are some of um, the the issues that have continued to further complicate the crisis in Congo and lead to Rwanda's continuous interference. And another issue is the fact that Rwanda remains strategic, in terms of its location and its allies with the West, Britain, America. These allies see Rwanda as an easy source of getting some of the minerals that are in the DRC. And so, as long as Rwanda remains relevant in that region, and able to lay hands on the resources, the natural resources in the DRC, because Rwanda is not as rich as the DRC is in terms of resources. All right. So as long as that continues to be the case, then Rwanda remains strategically positioned, and continues to serve the interest of the allies and maintain and the relationship it has, diplomatic relationship it has with the West and other partners. So that is one of the roles, the major factors that has continued um, to motivate, Rwanda's involvement in the affairs of the DRC. All right. There's also the case of Uganda as well. Uganda also is, another nation within that um, Great Lake region of Africa, and of course, they are all competing for natural resources, which are found in the DRC. They are all competing for natural resources found in the DRC. The more resources you have, the more your leverage, to negotiate with foreign partners and, of course, maintain diplomatic ties with foreign interests as well. So these are all factors that are propelling and motivating, foreign interference within the DRC. There's the role of multinational corporations too, which are either technology companies, mostly technology companies making smartphones, making other technological devices, who need resources, natural resources from the Congo to make their business thrive. All right, and so these multinational corporations continue to sponsor as much as possible, sponsor violence. All right, um, sponsor anarchy within the DRC, and of course within this anarchy, they're able to um, you know, to conduct their business without so much of any scrutiny or accountability, as it were. All right. So these are some of the issues that are going on in the DRC, which makes it a lot more volatile, and prone to conflict. And I mentioned also the role of China, and development aid in agreement for or in exchange for some of these raw materials too that are in the DRC. So it appears that the DRC's wealth in terms of mineral resources has resulted or translated to more of a curse, than a blessing. And this confirms, the resource curse theory in political science, where it says that countries that are rich in natural resources, tend to be tend to experience a lot of underdevelopment, and exploitation. And so these resources translate to be a curse rather than a blessing to these countries, because these countries that are rich, you know, in these resources happen to be the least developed, happen to be the most conflict ridden, happen to be where poverty is on the rise. And of course it's a paradox, because the reverse is supposed to be the case, but that is not what happens. And I mentioned the role of the United Nations peacekeeping since 1999, and the perceived inefficiency of these efforts, which has led to many Congolese asking for, the withdrawal of the UN troops in the region. So these are some of the factors and um, explanations, around the foreign influence in that region. All right. Now, what is the way forward? What is the way forward? Um, there needs to be peace building efforts. All right. There needs to be peace building efforts, genuine peace building efforts. The many tribes and nationalities within the Congo, must come together and agree, and of course, there has to be reconciliation for past hurts, past offenses or grudges that have continued to or that have existed, for a long time. So there has to be that reconciliation and peace building, and peace building efforts have to take place. All right. So there has to be genuine peace building efforts in that region. There has to also be economic infrastructural development, in the region. And of course, we know that without development, there cannot be peace. All right. So peace is development is a catalyst for peace, and so for peace to prevail in the DRC, then there has to be development. Hunger has to reduce, poverty has to go down. All right, infrastructure has to be seen, have to be developed. The people have to see benefits. Their lives have to change, standard of living has to improve, and all of these factors must be put in place before we can talk about peace being um, sustainable in that country, and of course by extension in that region as well. Strengthening regional cooperation, and African-led solutions. This is very, very key as well. All right. All the foreign influences from outside Africa, must be reduced as much as possible, and Africans themselves, must genuinely rise to the occasion to come up with solutions that will help to permanently, or to a very large extent, resolve the controversies that are going on in the DRC, especially around natural resources, governance, and you know, development, before peace can eventually be sustainable in that region. All right. Now, perhaps going back to my title as to why the guns will not stop in the DRC. These perhaps are some of the reasons why. All right. The DRC crisis is very complex. It's deep rooted. Like I mentioned, it goes back to the very origin of the nation itself. Okay. And so for any kind of peace that is going to be lasting, it has to be a very genuine process. It has to be a very detailed process, because the conflict has protracted a lot. It has been deeply rooted, and it's going to take quite a while. The peace that's going to eventually come has to be a process, and that process is going to be one that's going to be long lasting. All right, before it can bear any fruit. Okay, and then of course regional international cooperation, which is critical for the region, has to be genuine. But the question is, to what extent can those efforts be genuine, since there are still natural resources in the region, which of course are one of the major interests, of these forces, both regional and international. All right, so there has to be genuine international and regional cooperation, but the question is, to what extent can they be genuine? All right, unbiased sustainable development also has to be the order of the day. Governance reforms, all of these are the key to lasting peace. But your guess is as good as mine as to how possible, how feasible these conditions are. All right, but of course we cannot give up hope. The DRC is one nation in Africa that has been plagued by crisis for the longest time. All right, and the Congolese people themselves deserve, a good government. They deserve peace. They deserve prosperity. They deserve, you know, um, security for themselves, for their businesses, and so on and so forth. And so there has to be some kind of negotiation. There has to be some kind of consensus to get to see that conflict resolved. And one of the other problems is the fact that, the conflict in the DRC is not one that is talked about a lot in the media, especially in international media. All right, you see you see a kind of silence around these issues in the international media, in most of the international media. All right, and that is not serving the DRC any good at all. So these issues must be brought up. These issues must be discussed. There must be in conversation around these issues. There must be um, consensus. There must be compromise. On all sides, there must be compromise to get to see that um, genuine efforts are made to bring about lasting peace in the region, because the DRC they deserve peace. Deserve peace and national building, or nation building rather. Well, that's where we're going to end the presentation for today. I hope you have been able to learn one thing or two, about the conflict in the DRC from this presentation. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if there are any things that I have not touched on that you think are important and I need to talk about, or any other topics that you want me to make a presentation about, please leave them in the comment section, and I will do well to respond as much as I can. All right, until I come your way again in the next video, it is bye for now.